Before we begin, a quick note. This episode discusses suicide in the context of Bernard Stiegler's life and philosophy. If this is a difficult subject for you, please take care while listening. If you're struggling or having thoughts of suicide, don't do it alone. In the United States, you can dial 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. In the UK, you can call Samaritans free on 116 123. And wherever you are, please look up the support available near you. You start with a man in prison. Bernard Stiegler, a Frenchman. A man holding a gun at a bank counter, then getting caught, sentenced, locked away. A thief doing time. In prison, time is punishment. Time itself is the weapon used against you. The days don't move. The hours are molasses. The clock ticks like a hammer hitting your skull over and over, breaking you into fragments. And in that fractured space, Stiegler begins to read. He reads Derrida, he reads Foucault, he reads Plato. He rebuilds himself out of words and ideas the way some people rebuild engines. Philosophy becomes the file hidden in the loaf of bread, the escape plan. And here's the twist. The man who once stole money now steals back something more important. Attention, memory, time. Not his own, but ours. Stiegler walks out of prison not as a criminal, but as a philosopher obsessed with this one fact, that human beings are technical creatures. We build tools, we build machines, we build storage systems for memory. Clay tablets, papyrus, books, hard drives, TikTok. Every one of these things holds our memory for us. They shape us more than we want to admit. For Stiegler, this is the big wound in the heart of human life. We think we can control our technologies, but our technologies control us. The history of humanity isn't just a history of wars and kings. It's the history of how memory got outsourced, written down, externalized. And each time it did, something changed inside of us. Stiegler calls this tertiary memory. It's not your short-term memory, not your long-term memory. It's the memory out there in the world. Your photo albums, your Netflix queue, your Google searches. It's every time you forget something and then remember it by reaching for your phone. This is memory that isn't in your brain, but it's still yours. Except now it's controlled by corporations, stored on servers you'll never see, owned by people who don't know you, but know about you. This is the nightmare Stiegler spent his life diagnosing. The nightmare of a society that doesn't just steal your labor, but steals your attention. Advertising isn't just billboards anymore, it's a constant whisper. Engineered desires sliding under your skin, colonizing your wants before you even know you want them. The theft of time, the theft of care. For Stiegler, consumer capitalism is a factory of minds, mass-producing desire and depression at the same time. It's not just your money that gets proletarianized, it's your psyche. Your individuality gets sanded down, packaged and resold back to you. This is why he obsessed over technology as pharmakon, that Greek word that means both poison and cure, a drug that heals and kills depending on the dose. Writing is a pharmakon, television is a pharmakon, the internet too. The very tools that can free us, give us culture, preserve memory, expand knowledge, are the same tools that can enslave us, stupefy us, erase the future. And here's the part where it gets bleak. Stiegler didn't just write about this as some abstract theory. He felt it in his bones. He lived it. Prison had taught him what happens when your time is stolen. And at the end of his life, when the world felt like it was spinning faster than care could keep up, when technology was no longer an external memory but an invasive parasite, he gave in. In 2020, Bernard Stiegler ended his own life. The philosopher who wrote about care, who begged us to invent new ways of living with our technologies, was consumed by the very despair he warned us about. So today we are calling up the ghost of Bernard Stiegler to ask him, what does it mean to live in a world where attention is the most precious resource, where our memories are stored in someone else's cloud, where the tools we use to live can also be the tools that kill us? Stiegler's philosophy isn't just about technology, it's about us, about whether we can still invent a future where technology is cure, not poison, whether care can survive the algorithm, whether attention can be saved. And that's where we begin.
835.
Bernard Stiegler starts with a word older than banks, older than prisons, older than capitalism. A word stolen from Plato's Phaedrus, pharmakon. A word that means cure and poison at the same time. The drug that heals, the drug that kills. This is the central paradox Stiegler threads through every argument, every page, and every diagnosis of our age. Technology, he says, is the great pharmakon of human history. You sitting there listening to this, you think your phone is just a device, a tool, a neutral thing you use to check the weather, scroll Instagram, or text your mother. But Stiegler wants to slap the phone out of your hand and say, no, this is not neutral, this is a drug. This is a substance that is changing you every time you touch it. Depending on the dosage, it might expand you or it might rot you from the inside. This is the first wound of his philosophy, that technology is not separate from us. It is not something we pick up and put down like a hammer. Human beings are technical beings. We are the animal that survives only because we externalize what we cannot carry in our skulls. Think of fire. Think of flint tools. Think of the wheel. None of these were just tools. They rewired what it meant to be human. The wheel wasn't just transportation. It was speed. It was trade. It was conquest. The wheel stretched human time and distance, and with it, memory itself. For Stiegler, memory is the battlefield. He splits it into 3 layers. There's primary memory, the immediate experience you carry, the thing happening right now, like the sound of this sentence in your ears. There's secondary memory, the internal archive of your brain, the things you recall later, the smell of your grandmother's kitchen, the way your first heartbreak felt. And then there's tertiary memory. This is where Stiegler drops his bomb. Tertiary memory is what happens when we store experience outside of ourselves. A song recorded onto vinyl, a movie etched onto film, a diary entry written down. Or now, a photo on Instagram, an email on a server farm in Arizona, your Google search history stretching into infinity. This tertiary memory is not just storage. It doesn't just sit there waiting to be retrieved. It shapes how you think, what you remember, what you forget. It colonizes memory from the outside in. Once you externalize memory, you don't just recall, it recalls you. Take writing. Plato hated writing. In Phaedrus, he warned that writing was a pharmakon. It would poison memory, make people lazy, dependent on marks on a page instead of the discipline of recall. Stiegler seizes on this. He says Plato was both right and wrong. Writing did poison memory, but it also cured forgetfulness. It let knowledge travel. It let history survive. It was both simultaneously. And so it goes, technology after technology. The printing press, the radio, the television, the smartphone. Each one is a pharmakon, promising liberation while delivering addiction. Each one stretches and distorts human time, expanding possibility while corroding something essential. This is why Stiegler can't be slotted into the easy pro-tech or anti-tech camps. He knows the futility of that argument. To be human is already to be technical. You cannot rip tools away from the species without ripping away humanity itself. The question is not should we have technology. The question is what dosage are we taking and who controls the prescription? Because the kicker here is that tertiary memory is never neutral. Who controls it? Who stores it? Who curates it? That's where power hides. When your family photo albums were physical objects on your shelf, your memory was in your home. Now your photo albums live on iCloud. Your diary entries are in Google Docs. Your bookshelf is a Kindle you don't own, just license. The locus of your memory has shifted from your hands to servers owned by corporations. This, for Stiegler, is not just a technological change. It's a metaphysical theft. When memory is externalized, it doesn't just free you from the burden of recall, it structures the way you think, what you see, what you desire. And when tertiary memory is controlled by a handful of global corporations, then your very subjectivity is in their hands. Your Netflix continue watching screen is not neutral. It's not a convenient bookmark. It's tertiary memory feeding you back a curated diet of what it wants you to remember. Your YouTube recommendations are not just records, they are anticipations, shaping your future desires before you know you have them. This is memory turned into a machine of control. And here's the darker twist. When tertiary memory collapses into endless streams, into infinite scrolls, into algorithmic feeds, it doesn't just structure your memory, it destroys it. It replaces long memory with short attention. It erodes the capacity to recall slowly, deeply, carefully. Instead, it turns you into an amnesiac addicted to the next hit of novelty. This is what Stiegler means by the pharmacology of technology. The cure is also the poison. Without writing, you don't get philosophy. Without film, you don't get cinema. Without digital media, you don't get the ability to access a world of knowledge instantly. But with each cure comes the poison. Distraction, manipulation, stupefaction. So this is about the wound, the original paradox. Technology is the pharmakon shaping human existence from the beginning. And we are addicts, swallowing the pill without asking about the dosage. Pause for a second and think about your own memory. How much of what you remember is stored outside your head? Phone numbers, birthdays, conversations. Do you even recall the details of yesterday? Or do you rely on your camera roll to tell you what you did? Stiegler would say that's not an accident. That's a transformation of humanity itself. You can't just log off and walk away, because tertiary memory is not an app, not a feature, not even a device. It's the condition of being human now. The question isn't whether you use it, the question is whether it uses you. And that's where we leave this section. With the pharmakon sitting in your veins, memory externalized, the poison and cure indistinguishable, and the haunting sense that maybe our species has already handed over its mind, one server upload at a time. You think you own your time. You think you wake up in the morning and decide how your day unfolds. You think you're the captain of your little ship, charting a course through hours and minutes. Stiegler calls bullshit. What you own, what you think is yours, has already been stolen. Not your wallet, not your wages, although they're getting there. Deeper. What's stolen is your attention. In the old Marxist factory, what was taken from you was labor. You had your body, your skill, your sweat. You sold it for a wage, piece by piece, hour by hour. But Stiegler says we are past that now. Post-industrial capitalism doesn't just proletarianize your body, it proletarianizes your psyche. The real commodity isn't your hands anymore, it's your nervous system, your eyes, your focus, your desire. This is the attention economy. But before the phrase went viral, Stiegler already had it under his microscope. He saw it in advertising, he saw it in television, whole industries built not to sell you soap, but to sell your attention to whoever was paying for the soap to be seen. The product isn't the product is you. And here's the twist of the knife. Attention is finite. Scarcity is built in. You can print more money, you can mine more oil, you can't mince more attention. 24 hours in a day, a few of those sleeping, and what's left is the most precious raw material on earth. Capitalism figured this out and went hunting. Stiegler says this isn't just annoying commercials or manipulative jingles, this is the engineering of desire itself. When your attention is stolen, your individuality is stolen. He calls it symbolic misery, that dull ache of not knowing whether your thoughts are yours or if they've been prefabricated in a marketing boardroom. Think about it. You don't just want things out of nowhere, you're trained to want them. You don't wake up craving pumpkin spice lattes because they're a natural extension of your taste buds. You crave them because someone stole your attention long enough to implant that desire. By the time it feels like yours, it's already someone else's. This is what Stiegler means by psychic proletarianization. The old worker in the factory lost ownership of his tools, his craft, his skill. The modern subject loses ownership of his psychic individuation. Desire gets mass-produced, attention gets formatted. You become a copy of a copy of a copy, to borrow Polanyi's words. Now pull this forward. From the Mad Men era of television ads to the blue light of your smartphone screen at 3 a.m. The precision of the theft has escalated. It's not just Don Draper guessing at what housewives want. It's machine learning, algorithmic targeting, predictive analytics. It's your tertiary memory feeding back into itself, your searches predicting your desires, your clicks constructing your personality. The theft isn't random anymore, it's surgical. And you feel it, don't you? That itch when you try to read a book and your hand twitches towards your phone. That phantom vibration in your pocket. That brain fog after 20 minutes of scrolling where you can't remember what you saw, but you know you saw something. This isn't a side effect. This is the system working perfectly. For Stiegler, the theft of attention is also the theft of care. When your psychic life is hijacked, you lose the ability to linger, to nurture, to dwell. Care takes time, patience, repetition. Attention theft destroys that. Everything becomes short, instant, accelerated. And this is where the psychological fallout starts. Stiegler doesn't talk about dopamine receptors and neurochemistry. He doesn't need to. He talks about the collapse of individuation, the collapse of desire, the collapse of care. Depression as a structural feature of capitalism, not a personal failing. Burnout as a collective symptom, not a private weakness. Think of it like this. Every time you scroll, every time your attention is fragmented, the system is feeding on you. It grows stronger while you grow weaker. The rich get richer, not just in dollars, but in captured hours of human attention. And when the scale tips far enough, you're left with whole populations who can't focus, can't care, and can't imagine the future. That's the hidden theft. Not just your attention now, but your attention later. By flooding you with stimulation, the system robs you of the long memory required for culture, philosophy, art, literature. These depend on slow attention, cultivated attention. When you can't sustain it, culture withers. Civilization itself begins to hollow out. Stiegler calls this symbolic misery for a reason. It's not just that your wallet's empty, it's that your symbolic life, your dreams, your stories, your sense of self has been outsourced. Your capacity to imagine yourself outside the system has been stolen. And here's the tragedy. Most people don't even know it's happening. They confuse the theft for freedom. They call it choice, entertainment, convenience. Stiegler says this is the cruelest trick of all, to enslave people with their own desires, to make them addicted to the very thing that erodes them. Now let's zoom out for a moment. Stiegler is not the first to warn about this. Debord called it the society of the spectacle. Foucault talked about discipline and biopolitics. But Stiegler sharpens the blade. It's not just surveillance, it's not just spectacle, it's proletarianization of the psyche itself. And if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of his own prison years. A man who knew what it meant to have time stolen, to be reduced to a number in a cell. His philosophy is shot through with that experience. He isn't describing capitalism like an abstract economist, he's describing it like a survivor of captivity. This is why this feels so relentless, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Your attention is not yours. It's already a commodity, packaged and sold. Your scrolling thumb is the assembly line, your data is the raw material. And the question becomes, if they've stolen your attention, what's left of your freedom? For Stiegler, the answer is bleak but not hopeless. He insists that attention can still be reclaimed, but only if we treat it as a collective project, not a private hobby. Not digital detox weekends or mindfulness apps, which are just more commodification, but systemic reinvention of how we relate to technology, how we construct memory, and how we cultivate desire. The problem is capitalism isn't interested in care, it's interested in capture. And when capture becomes the law of the land, when every app, every platform, every advertisement is designed not to inform but to hijack, then resistance starts to look like madness. So here's the cliff we stand on. A world where attention is the new oil, mined and extracted until the well runs dry. A world where individuation collapses under the weight of manufactured desire. A world where the question is not what do you want, but who programs the wanting in you. And Bernard Stiegler, the ex-convict turned philosopher, is telling us, you didn't lose your attention, it was stolen. Imagine you're trying to read a book. A real book with a spine and pages that smell like dust and ink. You sit down, open the cover, and within 5 minutes, your brain screams for distraction. You check your phone. You skim. You glance at the clock. The idea of sustained attention feels painful, almost impossible. This, Stiegler would say, is not your fault. This is systemic. This is what happens when a civilization sacrifices care at the altar of speed. For Stiegler, care is not a soft word. It's not therapy speak. Care is the fundamental act of giving time and attention to something outside of yourself. To study, to nurture, to protect, to build. Care is the long, patient work of culture itself. Philosophy requires care. Education requires care. Love, friendship, even democracy, these are all forms of care. And when care collapses, everything else follows. But why does care collapse? Because it's slow. And speed is the drug of capitalism. Capitalism doesn't want you to linger. It doesn't want you to dwell. It doesn't want you to think for yourself or develop deep attachments. It wants circulation, acceleration. The faster you move, the faster money moves. And so every aspect of life gets tuned to the cult of speed. Faster connections, faster delivery, faster scrolling, faster forgetting. This speed eats into the possibility of care. To care for a child, for a partner, for a work of art requires time. To write a book or to read one, to cultivate knowledge or a garden requires patience. But patience is unprofitable. Reflection is unprofitable. Care is unprofitable. Stiegler's diagnosis is merciless. He says this erosion of care is not a side effect of capitalism. It is the engine itself. A system addicted to growth, acceleration, and instantaneity cannot afford the luxury of care. And so we arrive at a paradox. The very things that make life livable are the things being systematically destroyed. Here's where psychology slides in like a scalpel. When you live without care, when your attention is fragmented, your psyche begins to collapse. You feel this collapse in the language of mental health, burnout, anxiety, depression. But Stiegler doesn't treat these as individual pathologies. They are collective symptoms, structural, the body politic breaking down. He uses the word proletarianization again, and I wish he wouldn't because it's really difficult to say, but now in a deeper sense. Not only are your skills and desires proletarianized, stripped from you, but your very capacity for care is outsourced, automated, reduced to algorithms. You don't choose what to watch. Netflix auto-plays it. You don't decide how to shop. Amazon recommends it. You don't even remember for yourself. Your phone pings you. Care, once a slow and intimate process, becomes mechanized, replaced by technical systems that pretend to help you, but in truth, hollow you out. The result is a population of what Stiegler calls disaffected individuals. People alienated from their own attention spans, their own desire, their own capacity to imagine futures. He links this disaffection directly to social unrest, addiction, violence, and even suicide. When people cannot care for themselves, for others, for culture, they collapse into despair or rage. And this collapse is not random. It is produced, engineered. The same systems that claim to connect us, to streamline our lives, are designed to eliminate slowness, to eliminate the pauses where care might grow, to eliminate the possibility of thinking for yourself. Here's a concrete example for you. Think of how news is consumed now. Not long-form journalism, not careful reporting, but endless streams of headlines, tweets, and sound bites. News is no longer about understanding. It's about keeping up. Information as adrenaline. Events blur together, stripped of context, forgotten almost instantly. The news cycle is not a record of the world. It's an engine of amnesia. Or take education. Students no longer memorize facts, they Google it. Memory outsourced. Knowledge becomes skimming, test-taking, credentialing. Stiegler warns that this is the collapse of the very process of individuation. Because without long memory, without slow care, you don't form a self. You form a hollow, a shell filled with fragments. And then of course there's love, care in its most intimate form. Even here, speed corrodes. Dating apps transform courtship into swipes, affection into metrics, relationships into disposable commodities. Attention flits from one profile to the next, never lingering long enough to build depth. Stiegler would call this the industrialization of intimacy, the destruction of care in its purest form. But maybe the sharpest wound is the collapse of what he calls long time. Human beings once lived with a sense of long horizons, generations, traditions, futures stretching centuries ahead. Technology collapses this into real time, immediate, now, instant. Think of climate change. It requires long time. It requires collective care for generations yet unborn. But in a system wired for short-term speed, long-term care is impossible. Politicians chase quarterly cycles, corporations chase quarterly profits, citizens chase quarterly trends. The long future dies in the jaws of short-term speed, and I think that's probably why you never see anything constructive happen with it. Whether you believe in climate change or not, I do, by the way, but shit happens. Like you don't see change, really. You see ideas crop up and then nothing consistent. At least I don't, but correct me if I'm wrong. Stiegler ties this collapse of long time to what he calls the industrialization of memory. When memory is externalized and controlled by corporations, the ability to form long-term perspective disappears. You no longer hold the future in your imagination. It's managed for you by the same systems that profit from your distraction. And so society begins to feel like a machine running out of control, speed without direction, information without meaning, stimulation without care. The collective psyche burning itself out. This is where Stiegler turns almost prophetic. He says the collapse of care is not just a crisis of individuals, it is a crisis of civilization itself. Without care, culture cannot survive. Without care, knowledge cannot survive. Without care, the very conditions of being human collapse. And you see this everywhere. In the loneliness epidemic, in the rise of anxiety disorders, in the collapse of attention spans, in the politics of outrage, where speed and spectacle replace deliberation and reason. Every symptom is an echo of the same core disease, the erosion of care by the cult of speed. Stiegler does not offer comfort here. He doesn't pat you on the back and say you can fix it with a meditation app or a weekend off-grid. Those are just more commodifications of care, packaged and resold. His message is darker. Care can only be saved if society itself reinvents the conditions for it. If technology can be repurposed, redesigned, dosed properly to cultivate attention instead of destroying it. But he doubts whether this reinvention is possible under capitalism as it stands. Because capitalism thrives on speed, thrives on destruction, thrives on consumption. To ask it to slow down is to ask it to die. So we are left with this image. A civilization sprinting toward the cliff edge, unable to slow down, unable to care, and unable to imagine a future. A world where individuals stumble through burnout and despair, mistaking their personal suffering for weakness when in fact it is the symptom of a collective collapse. The question Stiegler leaves hanging is brutal. Can care survive in an economy that profits from its absence? That is the wound. Not just attention stolen, but care itself annihilated. The slow death of culture at the hands of speed. The future mortgaged to the instant. A civilization that can't linger long enough to save itself. Bernard Stiegler is not your typical philosopher. His philosophy begins with a gun in his hand. It's 1978. Stiegler is 26 years old. He's broke. He's angry. He's restless. He's the kind of man who can't see a future for himself in the respectable world. So he does what desperate men do. He robs banks. For 3 years he plays outlaw, pulling heists, living on stolen time. Until, of course, he gets caught. The law closes in. He's arrested, convicted, sentenced to 5 years in prison. And this is the paradox. Prison is supposed to erase you. That's what punishment means. Your time is stolen. Your days turned into blank pages. Your individuality crushed into a number. But for Stiegler, prison becomes the forge, the crucible, the place where he transforms from criminal to philosopher. In the cell, with nothing but hours to kill, he starts to read. And not casually, not just to pass the time. He reads like a drowning man grabbing for oxygen. Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Heidegger, Marx, and most of all, Jacques Derrida. The prophet of deconstruction, the one who taught him that texts are never innocent, that meaning is always slippery. Through reading, Stiegler begins to see his own life differently. He starts to understand that prison is not just walls and bars, it's a system of controlling time, a technology of punishment. And from there, his obsession crystallizes. Technology and time. The way every tool, every machine, every device reshapes how humans live and remember. By the time he's released in 1983, Stiegler isn't the same man. He leaves prison with no money, no job, but with a library burned into his brain. He carries philosophy like contraband. He walks out not as a robber, but as a thinker possessed. This is why his philosophy is so raw, so urgent. He writes like someone who knows what it means to have time stolen. Someone who has lived the violence of being reduced to a prisoner number. Someone who has clawed philosophy out of despair. And yet the shadow of that despair never leaves him. If prison gave him philosophy, it also branded him with a kind of wound. A wound that never really closed. You can see it in the way he writes. Always about loss. Always about theft. Always about collapse. Stiegler is a philosopher marked by tragedy from the beginning. Fast forward. He spends decades building his work. He writes about technology, about tertiary memory, about the proletarianization of the psyche, about the collapse of care. He becomes a major figure in French philosophy, though never as famous as Derrida or Foucault. He sets up institutes, research groups, think tanks. He's not just writing in the dark, he's trying to invent solutions, to create spaces where people can think differently about technology. But here is the cruel irony. The very system he diagnoses, capitalism as attention theft, as destruction of care, is the system he has to live inside. He watches as the internet grows into a monster. He watches smartphones colonize everyday life. He watches algorithms devour the possibility of long attention. He sees his darkest predictions come true in real time, and he knows he can't stop it. This is the tragedy of Bernard Stiegler. He could describe the disease with perfect clarity. He could name the poison in the pharmakon. He could map the collapse of care with surgical precision. But diagnosis is not cure. He could describe the sickness, but he couldn't build the medicine fast enough. Imagine that. Spend your life warning about the erosion of care while watching care erode. To write book after book about the colonization of attention while knowing your readers are too distracted to finish them. To insist that philosophy could invent new ways of living while watching society sprint in the opposite direction. By the end, Stiegler was haunted. He wrote openly about despair, about the collapse of the future. He was writing as someone drowning in the very ocean he described. And then came 2020, a year of pandemic, isolation, and acceleration. A year when governments declared states of emergency, when people lived inside screens more than ever before, when care collapsed further into exhaustion. For Stiegler, this must have been unbearable. The proof of everything he'd warned about, the world falling exactly as he predicted. In August 2020, Bernard Stiegler took his own life. He was 68 years old. It's hard to overstate the weight of this. The philosopher of care, the man who insisted that technology could still be reimagined, who fought for new forms of attention, finally succumbed to despair. It's not just biographical detail, it's philosophical punctuation. His suicide hangs over his work like a final chapter, a warning that the poison may already outweigh the cure. And yet, even in that tragic end, there is something brutally honest. Stiegler never pretended philosophy was safe. He never pretended thought was a shield against despair. His death proves his philosophy wasn't abstract. It was lived, embodied, unbearable. He was consumed by the very crisis he diagnosed. This raises a somewhat brutal question. If even Bernard Stiegler couldn't bear the weight of the world he described, what hope do the rest of us have? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the lesson isn't despair. Maybe the lesson is that his death is a signal flare, a warning shot, a way of forcing us to confront just how high the stakes are. That the collapse of care isn't an intellectual debate, it's a matter of survival. Because when we talk about Stiegler, we're not just talking about a philosopher. We're talking about a man who went to prison, who rebuilt himself with philosophy, who spent decades fighting against the erosion of care, and who finally lost that fight himself. His biography is inseparable from his thought. His life is the proof of his philosophy. And in that sense, Stiegler is less like a professor and more like a prophet, a tragic prophet, whose life story is a warning that if we do not reclaim attention, if we do not reinvent care, then despair will eat us alive. So here we are, with the tragic figure of Bernard Stiegler, the prisoner philosopher, the diagnostician of despair, the man who saw too clearly the sickness of his age and couldn't escape it. A man whose end forces us to ask, do we treat his suicide as defeat, or as the final urgency to take his ideas seriously? That's the cliffhanger. Stiegler's death isn't the end of the story, it's the turning point. Because if his life is tragedy, the question becomes, what do we do with the inheritance he left behind? So what now? If even the philosopher of care couldn't carry the burden of his own insights, what do we do with the shards he left behind? Do we let the despair wash over us too, shrug and say the machine already won? Or do we take his work as a challenge, an unfinished experiment, a set of weapons scattered on the ground waiting to be picked up? For Stiegler, resistance begins with attention, not the shallow kind, not the productivity hack, turn off your notifications bullshit. Attention as the very condition of being human. Attention as the capacity to linger, to think, to care. To resist is not simply to log off, it's to reclaim attention as the ground of life itself. But attention isn't something you rescue by yourself. Stiegler insists it's collective. Individuation, the process of becoming yourself, is never private. It's always relational. You become who you are through others, through culture, through memory. And when attention is stolen, it's stolen from all of us together, which means it can only be reclaimed together. This is where Stiegler diverges sharply from the Silicon Valley gospel of personal optimization. The self-help mantras of focus and productivity are, for him, just more poison disguised as medicine, another pharmakon, because they put the burden back on the individual as if distraction were your fault, as if burnout were a personal failing. Stiegler says no. This is systemic, structural, political. To fight it requires collective invention. So what would collective attention look like? For Stiegler, it begins with what he calls pharmacology. Remember, technology is not pure poison, not pure cure. It's both. The question is dosage, context, use. The same tool that erodes care can, if reimagined, cultivate it. Take writing. As we said earlier, Plato feared it would kill memory, and in some ways it did. But it also preserved knowledge, transmitted wisdom across generations. The cure is hidden inside the poison. The same goes for digital technology. The internet doesn't have to be an engine of distraction. It could be an archive of collective memory, a tool for shared learning, a platform for solidarity. But it won't become that on its own. Capitalism bends every tool toward capture and profit. To resist is to re-engineer, to subvert, to invent uses that nourish care instead of killing it. Stiegler believed this was possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. This is why he spent his later years creating institutions. He founded groups like Ars Industrialis, a collective dedicated to rethinking technology, culture, and industry. He wanted laboratories for experimenting with attention, with memory, with new forms of life. He knew that resistance couldn't just be theoretical, it had to be built. At the psychological level, this means practicing what he called attention technologies. Rituals, practices, spaces where attention is cultivated rather than fragmented. Reading groups, slow education, collaborative projects. Not consumption, but production. Not speed, but duration. And at the social level, it means redesigning systems. Education that teaches students how to think, not just how to skim. Media that informs rather than distracts. Platforms that create dialogue rather than outrage. It means reinventing pharmacology, crafting antidotes out of the poison itself. This is where Stiegler's hope glimmers, faint but real. He refuses the fantasy of going back to some pre-digital purity. There is no unplugged Eden waiting for us. To be human is to be technical, to live entangled with tools. The only way forward is through the pharmakon, through technology, but used differently. And here's the paradox. Even though Stiegler himself fell into despair, his philosophy points us toward care as the only possible survival. His life ended tragically, but his work insists that despair is not destiny. Despair is what happens when care collapses, which means that cultivating care, even in small, fragile ways, is resistance. Think about your own life. How often do you give slow attention to anything? How often do you linger with a book, a conversation, a thought, without checking a screen? Stiegler would say these moments are not trivial. They are acts of defiance, micro-resistances against the theft of attention. Every moment of care is a refusal to let the pharmakon dose you into oblivion. But he would also warn, individual moments are not enough. The system is too big, too efficient, too hungry. If resistance is to matter, it must scale. It must become collective. Shared rituals of care, shared spaces of attention, shared futures imagined together. This is where philosophy becomes politics. Because to demand care is to demand a reorientation of society, away from speed, away from profit, towards sustainability, culture, love, care for children, care for the planet, care for memory. All of these are interconnected. And maybe that's the final gift of Stiegler's thought, that he shows us how deeply philosophy, psychology, and politics are entangled. Burnout isn't just a private problem, it's a symptom of a world that has forgotten how to care. Anxiety isn't just a personal quirk, it's the feeling of living in a system that runs faster than your soul can follow. Depression isn't just chemical imbalance, it's the collapse of attention, the theft of long time. To resist is to reframe these experiences not as private pathologies but as collective struggles. To see your burnout not as a weakness but as a sign of the times. To see your fractured attention not as personal failure but as evidence of capture. And then to invent new ways of living together that re-center care. Is this utopian? Maybe. But Stiegler wasn't naive. He knew how powerful the forces of capture are. He knew how seductive the poison is. His own life proved it. But he also knew that giving up meant extinction, that without reinvention, the future closes. We end on a knife edge. Attention as resistance, care as survival, technology as pharmakon. The poison is everywhere, but so is the cure. The question is whether we will invent ways to dose ourselves differently, to reclaim attention not as private property but as collective treasure. And maybe this is why his thought matters more after his death than ever before. Because if we leave it at despair, then his suicide becomes prophecy. But if we take his challenge seriously, if we see attention as the last frontier of freedom, then his work becomes a map, not out of the pharmakon, but through it. So the last question Stiegler leaves us with is this: can we care enough to save care itself? So here we are, at the end of Bernard Stiegler's story, and maybe the beginning of ours. A man who robbed banks, served time, rebuilt himself in philosophy, and then spent his life trying to warn us that the real robbery was happening in plain sight. Not at the bank counter with a pistol. The real theft was quieter, more patient, more total. The theft of attention, the theft of care. Stiegler saw technology as a pharmakon, both poison and cure. That's the thread that runs through everything he wrote. Technology is never neutral. It's the drug that keeps us alive and the drug that kills us. Fire cooks your food or burns your house down. Writing preserves wisdom or makes memory lazy. Smartphones connect you or hollow you out. The poison and the cure are the same substance. What matters is dosage, and what matters even more is who controls the dosage. Right now, it isn't us. It's corporations, algorithms, governments. They decide what you see, what you remember, what you desire. The pharmakon has been weaponized, and the result is a civilization where care collapses, memory shrinks, and attention disintegrates. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The pharmakon isn't going away. You can't log off history. You can't throw your phone into the sea and call that freedom. The condition of being human is the condition of being technical. To be human is to live entangled with tools, with memory outside yourself, with technologies that shape you even as you shape them. So the question is not whether to escape the pharmakon. The question is how to live with it, how to redose it, how to use the cure without drowning in the poison. For Stiegler, the answer was care, slow attention, shared attention, the cultivation of memory and meaning outside the logic of profit and speed. He wanted us to invent new technologies of care, new ways of using the pharmakon to heal rather than destroy. And even though his own life ended in despair, that challenge remains. His work is unfinished because our work is unfinished. And maybe that's where the hope lives. Not in some fantasy of going backward, not in some Luddite denial of technology, but in the hard, patient labor of reinventing how we live with it. Every time you linger with a book, you're resisting. Every time you sit with a friend and really listen, you're resisting. Every time communities create spaces for care, for knowledge, for slow attention, they're resisting. Each act is small, but stitched together they might be enough to tip the dosage back toward cure. Still, the memory of Bernard Stiegler hangs over us. His suicide is not just biography, it's warning. It tells us how high the stakes are. It tells us that the collapse of care is not abstract but lethal. It tells us that if attention is stolen completely, if despair becomes a default state of the species, then the future closes. So we end where we began, with time. Prison taught Stiegler that time is punishment, that time can be stolen. Philosophy taught him that technology is the medium through which we share and destroy time. And his death teaches us that the question of how to live with technology is not theoretical, it's survival. The pharmakon is in our bloodstream now. Every scroll, every search, every notification is another dose. Poison and cure mixed together. The only freedom left might be the freedom to choose where we place our attention, to care in the face of indifference, to slow down in the face of speed, to invent futures where memory isn't just outsourced but nourished. Stiegler's final lesson is brutal but clear. If attention is the last scarce resource, then care is the last form of resistance. And the only real question left is whether we'll remember that in time. Thank you, you beautiful lot, for joining me on this journey into the mind and work of Bernard Stiegler. I hope that he's given you something to think about and something to take away from the episode. As always, if you want to comment on stuff, if you want to get involved in the discussion, I told you I always lose it at the end, I would love to hear from you. We have a website on Substack called theobservingeye.com. You can find all of the episodes on there, and you can listen to them without these fucking adverts as well. So, in the spirit of Bernard Stiegler, if you're watching on YouTube and you get adverts, and same for Spotify, go and listen to it direct without all of that commercial bullshit. We're also on social media, but after the episode that I've just done, I would feel deeply hypocritical to go and promote all of that bullshit. So, yeah, ignore it. I'm not even going to mention it now. I'm not going to tell you where they are. You can, however, email me if you want. I have an email address. It's been open for some time, and I do take emails from everyone. You can come and wax philosophical, or you can recommend ideas for future episodes, and you can email me about that on david@theobservingeye.com. Remember, that's a letter I, not the gelatinous organ through which you see. I, of course, try to get back to everyone as soon as I can. That's it from me. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.